The call came at 6:47 in the morning, and I know that because I'd been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee, watching the birds at the feeder my daughter had given me 2 Christmases ago. My son-in-law's name was Timothy. He worked fleet logistics for a mid-sized shipping company out of Columbus, drove the same stretch of I-71 every Tuesday and Thursday to meet with their regional office. He was 38 years old, careful with money, careful with his car, the kind of man who rotated his tires on schedule and kept a roadside kit in the trunk, the kind of man you assumed would outlive you. The highway patrol officer who called me that morning used words like single vehicle incident and no signs of other involvement. He said Timothy had gone off the embankment just past the Ashland County line around midnight. He said it was likely over quickly. He said he was sorry for my loss. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended. My daughter was 29. They had been married 4 years. No children yet, though they'd talked about it. My daughter had mentioned it at Easter. The way she mentioned things she was only half ready to say out loud, sort of sideways, watching my face for a reaction. I told her there was no rush, that they had time. That was 8 months before the embankment on I-71. I drove to Columbus the same afternoon. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter throughout this, because this is her story as much as it is mine, and I won't put her name into something this ugly. My daughter had already been notified. She was sitting in the living room of the house she and Timothy had bought together in Worthington, a suburb north of Columbus with good schools and wide sidewalks, and the kind of quiet that young couples mistake for safety. She was wearing his hoodie. She looked very small. Her husband's name was Nolan. She'd met him 8 months after Timothy died. I'm getting ahead of myself. The first 3 months after the funeral, I stayed close. I drove down from my house in Mansfield every weekend, sometimes twice a week if she called and her voice sounded thin. I brought food she didn't ask for, and fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing because I needed to feel useful, and she knew that, and she let me. That was the kind of person my daughter was. She understood people's needs before they said them out loud. I thought about Timothy every day. I thought about the drive he made twice a week, the route he could do in his sleep. I thought about the highway patrol officer saying no signs of other involvement. I thought about what that phrase meant and what it left out. About 4 months after the funeral, I asked to see the accident report. My daughter said she'd already looked it over with the insurance company. She said there wasn't anything unusual. She said it was late. He was probably tired. These things happen. I let it go. For a while. Then I met Nolan. She introduced him to me on a Sunday in February, a little over 5 months after the accident. She'd mentioned she'd been seeing someone, and I'd said what any father says, that I just wanted her to be happy, and I meant it. Grief doesn't have a schedule. I knew that. I'd lost her mother 11 years before, and I remembered how strange it felt to suddenly want company again, how guilty that wanting made you feel. But when I shook Nolan's hand in her kitchen that Sunday, something shifted in me. Not a thought. More like a temperature change. The way the air in a room drops a few degrees before a storm, and you feel it in your back before you feel it anywhere else. He was 44. He sold commercial real estate, office parks, warehouse space, the kind of properties that exist on the edges of cities where the roads get wide and the signage gets ugly. He was well-dressed in the careful way of someone who has thought about being well-dressed. He knew the right things to say, and he said them, and every single one landed just slightly too perfectly, like a man who had rehearsed being charming rather than actually being it. He asked me about Mansfield. He asked what I'd done before retirement. He said he admired men who'd worked with their hands. I'd spent 30 years in commercial HVAC, said it with a kind of performed respect that made me feel studied instead of seen. I smiled and ate my daughter's pot roast and drove home and didn't say a word. But I started paying attention. In March, she mentioned casually that Nolan thought the Worthington house might be worth putting on the market. That prices were up in that neighborhood, that she was rattling around in all that space, that maybe something smaller made more sense. I asked if she'd thought about it seriously. She said not really, just something they'd talked about. In April, she mentioned it again, less casually. The house was in her name. Timothy had insisted on that. They'd bought it with an inheritance from his mother's side, and he put it in my daughter's name specifically because it was her family's money that made the down payment possible. She'd told me that detail years ago, almost in passing. I'd remembered it the way you remember things you don't know yet that you'll need. I started doing things I'm not entirely proud of. I'm 63 years old, and I am not, by nature, a suspicious man. I spent my career showing up when people's heating failed in January and their AC quit in January and their AC quit in July, doing the work, taking the check, going home. I did not follow people. I did not look up public records on a Saturday morning with reading glasses and lukewarm instant coffee. But I did those things. I pulled the accident report myself through the Ohio State Highway Patrol records request process. It took 2 weeks and a $12 fee. The report described road conditions as dry, visibility as clear. It listed the time of the incident as 11:58 p.m. It listed no mechanical failure as a contributing factor. It listed driver fatigue as the probable cause. Driver fatigue. For a man who drove that road twice a week and was home by 9 on a normal night. Who had, according to a text he'd sent my daughter at 10:22 p.m., just left a dinner with a client and was heading back. A man who had eaten, who was not long haul, who knew every curve of that stretch of interstate. I called the mechanic Timothy used. His shop was out in Galena, east of Columbus, a one-bay place run by a man named Al who'd serviced Timothy's car for 6 years. I told Al who I was. I told him I was trying to understand what happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I've turned over in my mind every day since. He said, his car was in here 3 weeks before the accident. Brakes were fine. I did a full inspection. Everything was in order. I asked if anyone else had worked on the car after that. He said not through him. I asked if the brakes could have been tampered with after his inspection without leaving obvious signs on the rotor or the caliper, enough to cause gradual failure at speed, but not to trigger warning lights or obvious pedal problems in normal driving. He was quiet again. Longer this time. He said, that's not something I want to speculate about over the phone. I thanked him and hung up. I want to be honest about what I was thinking at that point, because I'm aware of how this sounds. I was a grieving father looking for a reason. I know that. People who lose someone to an accident will sometimes invent foul play because foul play is something you can fight, and a wet road or a falling asleep moment is not. I was aware I could be doing exactly that. But I also knew that Nolan had appeared in my daughter's life 8 months after Timothy died. That he was pushing her to sell a house worth $420,000 in a neighborhood where prices were still climbing, and that he had asked me with a practiced smile what I'd done before retirement. And I knew that Timothy had told my daughter, 2 weeks before he died, that something at work felt wrong, that a deal he wasn't supposed to know about had his name attached to it somehow. That he tried to talk to someone above him and been told to leave it alone. My daughter had mentioned this to me the week after the funeral, as a detail, as background noise in her grief. She hadn't connected it to anything. I had. I drove back to Columbus in early May. I told my daughter I was coming to help her with some yard work, which was true, and I asked if I could stop by her office on the way in, which she thought was sweet. While I was there, I asked her gently whether she'd ever followed up on what Timothy said about work, the deal, the conversation with his manager, the unease. She looked at me the way my daughter looks at me when she's deciding how much to say. Then she said she hadn't. She said she didn't really know where to start. She said she didn't want to pull on threads that would just make everything worse. I said that was understandable. I said I was just asking. Then I drove to the shipping company. I didn't have an appointment. I walked in and asked to speak with whoever handled internal compliance or HR matters. The receptionist, a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, made a call and then pointed me to a waiting area with ergonomic chairs and a water cooler and a motivational poster that said something about teams. I waited 40 minutes. Then a man came out who introduced himself as the regional operations director. His name was Sherman. He was about 50, medium build, the kind of tired that comes from managing things rather than fixing them. He shook my hand and took me to a small conference room and closed the door and asked me how he could help. I told him who I was. I told him that my son-in-law had died 8 months ago and that I had questions about a situation he had raised with someone at the company shortly before his death. Sherman's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, very slightly, like a window shade adjusted a half-inch. He said he was sorry for my loss. I said I appreciated that. I said I wasn't there to cause trouble. I said I just wanted to understand what Timothy had found and whether anyone at the company had looked into it after his death. Sherman said he couldn't discuss internal personnel matters. I said I understood. I said I was going to be honest with him. I'd already requested the accident report. I'd already spoken with Timothy's mechanic, and I was going to keep asking questions until I either found answers or ran out of questions to ask. I said I was 63 years old and retired and I had considerable time. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Give me your number. I'll be in touch." I gave him my number and drove to my daughter's house and helped her weed the garden and didn't say anything about where I'd been. Sherman called me 4 days later. He asked if I could come back to the office. He asked me to come alone and not to tell my daughter I was coming. He said those two things carefully, like a man reading from a mental checklist. I drove to Columbus the next morning. He met me in the same conference room. This time he had a folder. He told me that Timothy had come to him 3 weeks before his death. That Timothy had discovered, while processing a routine shipment manifest, that a series of transactions had been routed through the company's logistics network in a way that didn't match any legitimate client account, that the transactions were small enough individually to avoid triggering automated flags but added up to roughly $300,000 over 14 months. That Timothy had traced them to an external account and had given Sherman a printout. Sherman had taken it to corporate security. Corporate security had begun a quiet internal review. Timothy had died 12 days later. I asked if the review found anything. Sherman said the account the funds had been routed to was registered to a Shell LLC in Delaware. He said that by the time they'd identified the beneficial owner, the account had been drained and closed. I asked who the beneficial owner was. Sherman slid a single sheet across the table. I looked at the name. It wasn't Nolan's legal name. It was a variation, a middle name used as a first, a slightly different spelling of the surname. But I'd done enough digging by then to know his full legal name. I'd found a court filing from a civil dispute in Franklin County from 8 years ago, a contract disagreement with a former business partner that had been settled out of court. The name on that filing matched the name on Sherman's sheet closely enough. I sat in that conference room for a long time. Sherman said corporate security had not taken it to law enforcement. He said it had been handed to their legal department and had been sitting there. He said he'd been told that without a direct evidentiary link to the account holder's current identity, they couldn't make a definitive referral. He said he'd been thinking about calling me since I walked in the first time. He said, "I don't know what happened to your son-in-law on that highway. I genuinely don't know. But I know what he found, and I know the timing, and I've thought about it every day for 8 months." I took the sheet with me when I left. I drove to the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel on the edge of Columbus and sat for a while. Not crying exactly. Something quieter than crying. The particular stillness that comes when something you've half believed for months gets confirmed and you realize you would have given anything to be wrong. My son-in-law had found something he wasn't supposed to find. He had tried to report it. He had died on a clear, dry night on a road he drove twice a week, attributed to fatigue, case closed. And 8 months later, the man who had been siphoning money through his company was dating my daughter and encouraging her to liquidate the largest asset in her name. I called a lawyer from that parking lot, not a family lawyer, a criminal defense attorney who a neighbor of mine had used some years back and spoken well of. I explained what I had without using names. He listened, asked 3 questions and told me that what I was describing was potentially several federal crimes and that I should contact the FBI field office in Columbus. I said I was worried about my daughter, that if I moved too fast, if Nolan felt cornered, I didn't know what he would do. The lawyer said the concern was reasonable. He said to document everything I had before doing anything else. He said to make copies of everything and store them somewhere separate from my home. I did that. Then I did something else. I called my daughter. I asked if she was free for dinner that Friday. She said yes. I said I'd bring Italian from the place she liked in Short North. She said, "Perfect." I picked up the food and I drove to her house and we sat at her kitchen table and I watched her for a while. The way she pulled her sleeves over her hands when she was relaxed, the way she still set 2 placemats out of habit even when she was eating alone, and had just shifted to 1 in the last few weeks, which I noticed and said nothing about, and that I told her that I needed to talk to her about something difficult. She put down her fork. I told her carefully. I left out some of the worst of it at first. I told her I'd looked into Timothy's accident, that I'd spoken to his mechanic, that I'd gone to the company. I told her what Sherman had told me about the transactions and the timing. I told her about the LLC and the name on the sheet. She was very still through all of it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "How long have you been doing this?" I told her since February, since I shook Nolan's hand. She looked at the table. She said, "I felt something. I told myself I was being unfair." I reached across and put my hand over hers and didn't say anything. She asked me what we were going to do. I told her I'd already called a lawyer, that the next step was the FBI office, that I needed her to not change anything in her behavior around Nolan until we'd spoken with law enforcement. No confrontation, no different routine, nothing that would put him on alert. She said, "He asked me last week to put the house in both our names before we sold it. He said it would simplify the transaction." I looked at her. She said, "I told him I'd think about it." The FBI field office in Columbus took the case seriously from the first meeting. I was there with my daughter and the attorney, and we laid out everything: the LLC documentation from Sherman's company, the accident report, the timeline, the request about the house. The agents asked detailed questions. They asked them twice, in different orders, the way people do when they're checking for consistency. They told us not to discuss the investigation with anyone. They told my daughter to continue as normally as she could. It took 9 weeks. In those 9 weeks, I drove to Columbus more times than I can count. I sat with my daughter on her front porch, and we talked about Timothy, really talked about him. The way you sometimes can't, until some time has passed. The specific way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. The collection of vintage road maps he kept in a basket by the couch. The way he called me every Father's Day without fail since the year he and my daughter started dating, before they were even engaged, because he said it felt right. She cried a lot in those weeks. So did I. Nogan continued to call her. She answered, kept her voice even, told him things were fine, told him she was still thinking about the house. I don't know how she did it. She is stronger than I've ever given her credit for, which is something I've told her since, and something I intend to keep telling her. On a Tuesday morning in late September, FBI agents arrested Nolan at his office in Dublin, Ohio. They executed search warrants simultaneously at his residence, a rented house in Powell, and at a storage unit registered to the same Delaware LLC. The charges included wire fraud, money laundering, and one count I will not recite here, but that relates to what may have happened on a highway in Ashland County on a clear night in October of the prior year. That charge is pending. The investigation is ongoing. I have been told not to speak to it. What I can say is that the financial charges alone carried potential sentences measured in decades. What I can say is that my daughter is still in her house in Worthington. She planted bulbs in the front garden last fall, tulips and daffodils, things that take a season underground before they appear. What I can say is that on Father's Day, this past June, I sat on her porch and she handed me a card, and inside it she had written, in her handwriting that looks exactly like her mother's, that she was grateful I had driven to Columbus that day in February when something felt wrong in my back before it formed into a thought. I didn't go looking for any of this. I want to be clear about that. I am a retired HVAC technician from Mansfield, Ohio. I am 63 years old. I watch birds at the feeder and drink my coffee too cold and fall asleep in my recliner before the 10 o'clock news. But Timothy used to call me every Father's Day because it felt right. And when I shook Nolan's hand in my daughter's kitchen and the air dropped a few degrees, I decided that I owed Timothy the same thing he had given me for years without anyone asking him to. I owed him the truth, pursued without stopping, for as long as it took. I'm still pursuing it. and I will not stop. I think about the birds at the feeder a lot these days. The ones my daughter gave me 2 Christmases ago, before any of this happened. I was sitting there watching them the morning the highway patrol called, and I've gone back to that image more times than I can count. The ordinary quiet of it, the cold coffee, the way the world looked exactly the same as it always had while everything was already broken. That's the thing about what's wrong in your life. It doesn't announce itself. It sits in the room with you while you drink your coffee and you feel it somewhere in your body before your mind catches up. I felt it when I shook Nolan's hand. Not a thought, not a reason. Just that drop in temperature. That thing in my back. I almost talked myself out of it. I almost decided that a grieving old man from Mansfield had no business trusting a feeling over a police report and a closed case and his own daughter telling him she was fine. But I didn't talk myself out of it, and I've thought about why. Timothy used to call me every Father's Day, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was required, because he said it felt right. That's a small thing to describe a person's character, but I've found that the small things are almost always the truest ones. He was a man who did what was right when no one was watching, and when no one would have noticed if he hadn't. He found something in a shipping manifest that wasn't his job to find. He reported it knowing it would be uncomfortable. He did it because it was the honest thing to do. That cost him everything. And for a long time I couldn't make peace with that. That integrity, real integrity, had not protected him. That doing the right thing had not kept him safe. But I came to understand that the alternative was worse. The alternative was a man who saw what Timothy saw and looked away. Who decided the personal risk wasn't worth it. And if Timothy had been that man, then my daughter would have sold her house, and Nolan would have taken the money, and the truth would have stayed buried. Timothy's honesty, even unfinished, even cut short, was the thread I followed all the way to that conference room in Columbus. What I did over those months, the records requests, the drive to the shipping company, the parking lot with cold coffee and a lawyer's number, none of it was brilliant. I am not a detective. I'm a retired HVAC technician who reads the weather report and falls asleep before the news. But I paid attention. I asked the next question every time I wanted to stop asking. I followed the logic even when it led somewhere I didn't want to go. That's not intelligence in the way people usually mean it. It's just the willingness to think clearly when your emotions are telling you to collapse. And then there was my daughter. 9 weeks of answering his calls and keeping her voice steady and not flinching. 9 weeks of knowing what she knew and acting like she didn't. I watched her do that and I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. That real strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep going anyway. One ordinary day at a time, because the people you love are worth the cost of holding yourself together. Nolan made a different set of choices. He chose convenience over honesty, and then he chose to protect that choice at every turn. And each step made the next one easier and the way back harder. That's how it works. Not fate, not punishment, just consequence. The decisions compound, the weight accumulates, and eventually the structure collapses under what it was always going to collapse under. My daughter planted tulips last fall. They came up this spring right on schedule. She called me when they opened, and I drove down to see them. And we stood in the front yard of her house. That is still her house. And I thought about Timothy, and I was glad I hadn't talked myself out of that feeling in my back. I was glad I stayed at the table,